scaling up and keeping our organization sustainable for the long term are really different than I think a lot of the challenges that other sort of domestic microfinance institutions face. So we're going to talk, or I'm going to talk about Elmseed's experience in particular. My staff are laughing at me because it's a flowchart, and I really like flowcharts. So Elmseed basically is a student-run organization, has two primary challenges that we have to deal with. One of those is turnover, the fact that we're constantly getting new students, people are constantly leaving the organization. That if you think about a single sort of any given year period, we have about 80% of our staff turnover, which is really, really high. And the second is that it's all sort of volunteer run. I'm going to be focusing specifically on the issues of turnover, and even within that sort of institutional memory. And I think we see this breaking down into three sort of general problems which bleed together at times. So in institutional memory, basically, we have the problem that it's really difficult to transfer knowledge across generations of leadership or of students. So if you have someone that basically runs an organization for several years at a time, obviously they've got a wealth of knowledge about how particular small businesses work, about the way to do things efficiently. They have a sense of what the failures were in the past and what doesn't work so that they don't do that again. But the problem is we have to try to avoid reinventing the wheel every single semester as students. Because if we're simply bringing on new people, we have no knowledge of, say, what worked for me 5 years ago. And so how to transfer that down and sort of build Elmseed up as an institution so we can last beyond any given leadership tenure is a pretty difficult challenge. So specifically within institutional memory, we see a couple of problems. One is sort of variance at outcomes, and especially at the entry level, that there's basically a lot of students who come in, and it's hard to create sort of good training and make sure that in any given client relationship, we're doing a really good job. Because they're going to maybe be coming in and having their first client relationship with that person instead of the 50th client that they've seen. The second is sort of what we call maybe organizational oscillation. So this is just sort of the idea that, or strategic inconsistency, these sort of go together, that basically, in my leadership term, Jazz and I's, there's basically a different set of priorities than came in the past. And how you sort of keep continuity over time to make sure that you're constantly moving in the right direction and building on successes rather than sort of going one direction and then starting to go another direction and basically building a bunch of systems which don't actually lead you towards some sort of end goal. And then finally, it's really difficult to sustain good processes or systems. So once we figure out an intake procedure, transferring that over to the next generation and making sure that handoff is really effective can be quite difficult at times. The other problems of turnover, which I'm going to talk less about, but may touch on indirectly, are that we have inconsistent relationships. And as you noticed, in the earlier presentation we had about community outreach, having consistent relationships is actually pretty important for running an organization like we do. So there's a question of how do we transfer these over effectively, both in terms of institutions, in terms of community ambassadors or sort of loan officers out in the community, clients, institutional donors, alumni, even our board of directors, which sticks around for 3-year terms, is going to be around longer than most of the executive directors, or what than all the executive directors or staff. And then finally, the third sort of thing with turnover is that we've got inadequate training at times. And we've really got to try to figure out how to solve this problem, because in any given sort of, let's take a semester, and let's assume it's maybe 4 months, the first month of that, we've got to do recruitment and then training for all of our new staff. So that's at least a quarter of our time where we're devoting a lot of energy towards making sure that we're getting the right talent on campus and then training them in the right way to do the things that we need to do to run the organization. So we have sort of 3 sets of things that we think help solve these challenges of specifically institutional memory is what I'm going to be primarily addressing, how to hand down knowledge. So tools, systems, and institutions. And under tools, we've got a few things like this, high-rise. This is something that a lot of you guys are familiar with, that you use it. I think many of you use this already. And basically, this is sort of a contact management tool that we can keep track of any given individual, community partner, client, whatever. And whenever there's sort of an update about that person, we can put this online so that, say, I can go and look at our relationship with, say, Josh, who was a former executive director, now serves on the board of directors, and knows sort of what interactions he had with us so that I understand how to interact with him. Or if, say, a client comes back over time, and this is a client that I didn't deal with, in my time, he's from 3 years ago, that we understand what sort of backstory there is there and maybe why he's no longer a client anymore. So this is a really important tool, and we try to keep track of basically any sort of individual contacts that we have there. And another really cool thing about this is actually there's a BCC function, and one of the reasons we choose to use this contact management tool is because you can BCC high-rise, meaning that anytime you write an email to someone, it basically drops that email in here, and there's a record of communication between people, which is really valuable, either for clients, organizations, whatever. Second tool we use is Backpack, and this is sort of a content management tool in the sense that we basically can put a lot of documents up here. So back from when we had our sort of membership model, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, there's membership applications or loan documents that we keep online. And this basically mitigates the need to have physical documents, although we'll keep those as well. But it makes sure that we can always sort of keep track of these in consistent ways, that if I ever need to go back and find minutes from the board of directors meeting in 2002, I can still do that and understand what decisions were made there and why we chose to make those decisions. Because otherwise, there's this sort of problem that I don't know why we decided to potentially, unless we have sort of things like this, I don't know why we decided to transition away from a group lending model into an individual lending model, and like why that decision was made and what problems there were and how we fixed those. So this is actually incredibly valuable for putting all sorts of documents up there, from agendas to minutes to loan documents, anything like that. And then finally there's Zoho, which is a big push that we've had in the last year, and actually something we took away from this conference last year. Is really trying to figure out a way to manage a lot of our information better, and we thought this was one of the ways we could do it. And this is something I know several of the other organizations have been doing this. So for us, we're still trying to clean this up and make it a little bit, notice on the left there's a ton of tabs. So we're trying to create the aesthetic a little bit better, but it allows us to enter an inquiry online and then track all of our inquiries over time so that we can see in a given semester how many inquiries did we have. And this is actually really important because prior to last semester, we had physical records or like individual people, kept Excel documents or Google Docs of, for example, when people contacted the organization. But we didn't have anything like this where you could just go back and look like, okay, fall 2011, how many inquiries did we have? And this is actually something that's really important to track over time. And we can also tell where inquiries are coming in, for example. Or now we've put a preliminary loan application on Zoho so that someone can on the phone take a preliminary application for a loan, put all that information in, get it sent off to a loan officer, and then we can get back to them within 24 hours with an initial decision. So having these types of online systems and tools actually really helps us manage the challenge of creating an institution rather than just a set of individuals that stick around for a long time. Because unfortunately we don't have that sort of advantage. So the next thing we have to manage it is systems, and one of them is essentially. So this means picking the next sort of generation of leadership ahead of time and making sure they have the tools they need to succeed. So one of the problems is if you have got an executive director coming in and they don't have a great full scope of the organization because they've been in a particular department, there's going to be a pretty long lag time until they sort of understand the full set of challenges and are able to start making strategic decisions moving in that direction. So what we try to do both at the executive board level, so basically departmental heads, and at the executive director level, is identify candidates early on and sort of start giving them, training and sort of getting them up to speed. And one point on grooming, actually, in terms of how sort of top of mind this is for us, it literally on a weekly basis, we're having staffing conversations about, who's going to take over this department next, or who are at least the candidates that are going to take over this department, so that we make sure that they're ready to move into that role and not just sort of that department falls apart when the person who's been there leaves. The second is a transition letter, which is basically a comprehensive record of what's happened over the past year and also the responsibilities that a particular role entails. So this involves both for executive directors handing off to the next generation of executive directors, but also for department heads on our executive board handing off to next department heads, making sure they lay out clearly what responsibilities they've been in charge of, how they've met those responsibilities, key changes they made over the term, people within the department, staffers, what their responsibilities are, and you make sure that it's sort of clear what you're going to need to do. And this is no substitute for some pretty long conversations about taking over the department, but it's at least something that they can always refer to. The third thing is sort of mid-level positions, and this means that basically the way our organization is structured is that we've got a lot of staff, 35 to 40 total. Of those, there's about 10 executive board members who are departmental heads or something like that, CFO, whatever. And then there's 2 sort of co-executive directors, sort of CEO and COO. What we've tried to create are positions that are sort of intermediary between just staff and executive board, because there's a pretty significant jump in terms of both time commitment and ability to think about things across the organization. So we've tried to create some sort of institutionalized functions, like, for example, director of client intake, where that's sort of an institutionalized function where someone's responsible for having the intake interviews, getting information, putting it on Soho, and all of that. So this sort of helps train people in advance of taking on a larger role, sort of an intermediary step. The next thing is sort of joint teams. So basically having two consultants work on any individual client in a consulting relationship, or even in the sort of loan preparation phase, having two people generally work through that. And the advantages are that we can put one senior person with one junior person, and there's sort of a mentorship type thing going on. So we always try to have the sort of formalized training that we have at the beginning of each semester, the sessions where we teach different modules. Those can only go so far, we think, and a lot of it's just about jumping in and getting your feet wet. But if you can do that in the context of having one person who's been around for at least a semester, it helps the junior person get up to speed more quickly. The next thing is mid-year changeover. So the way that we're structured, I think similar to a lot of you guys, is that we don't end student terms in spring. Instead, we actually end them in January. And the reason we choose to do that is because, for example, I will hand off to the next, Jazz and I will hand off to the next co-executive directors January 1st, but we'll still be around for the spring semester to help overcome challenges, probably meet with them on a weekly basis to talk about at a macro level what are things going on with LMC, make sure that there's some sort of consistency from what our strategic vision was to the next, and also help them sort of gain challenges. And the same is true again of the department heads. And then finally, I guess this is not really a system so much, but a minor point is that we have a physical office. And we had one of these for a while. We got rid of it for some portion of time, and we realized it's actually a really valuable place to, one, just store documents, and to two, have sort of a common space where our staff and clients can go and meet and do things. But the being able to store things is really important. Then under institutions, we have a board of directors. And the board of directors basically serves a couple functions. One thing that they're really valuable at doing for us, this is non-students, this is a group of professionals from the community, whatever, and they can help sort of also bridge the gap in terms of strategic continuity. So they can make sure that over time, they've been around for a while, they can see the things that work and haven't worked, and can tell new leadership, hey, we tried this out a couple of years ago, it didn't work as well. Historical context. It's often an outlet for former leadership. So several former executive directors have eventually gone on to serve on our board of directors, things of that nature. But the caveat is you do want to be pretty careful about how you define the scope of the board of directors. Right now, our board of directors has authority over sort of making decision about loans, which has clear advantages. But also at the same time, it definitely means there's at times a lag, because there's an ability, they have a limited ability to schedule meetings to review loans, or to have them even on the phone, whereas we can move much faster as sort of a staff because we're doing this more frequently. So the caveat I would have here is just think very carefully about the scope of the board of directors and what you want their role to be. So the second thing I was going to talk about, which actually doesn't tie directly to institutional memory, is our evolving model over time. So this graph is basically our loan volume on the left, and then years that we've been around. And we started out from 2001 to 2006 on a group lending model. And the reason I'm talking about this is to basically put our experience in perspective to a lot of you guys who are trying to figure out where you want your model to go. And hopefully it's instructive as to why we made certain shifts when. So we started out with group lending model, 5-person centers. You guys are probably pretty familiar with this. But there were some limitations, which was that basically we could take on clients once a semester. We had one shot at the end of September or early October where we could take on a center or 2 centers, and then finish up by the end of the semester and then take it on a second time. That's really limiting because you're basically defining what you can do based on your ability to produce rather than clients' needs. And I think a lot of the transitions we've tried to make are figuring out how can we actually serve clients, not can we figure out how do clients fit into what we're able to do. So basically there was a limit on how many number of clients we could serve. And then there was also the problem that I don't think many people have really been able to figure out or how to make group lending work particularly well in the US. Vermeer has done it very well in the developing world and a number of other international microfinance institutions. Vermeer also does it domestically, but I think most of us have found it pretty difficult to really leverage social relationships in the same way that the theory is supposed to work. It works a lot, I think, better in practice, or in theory than it does in practice. And in particular, there's a problem that when a group falls apart, it just sort of crumbles, and all of your lending that you're trying to do to that one particular group of 5 people just doesn't really work anymore. And that is sort of what happened in 2006 when we had 2 people from a group default on their loans. And those were very large loans relative to us. So 2006 was actually 2 $6,000 loans that both defaulted partway through. We switched in 2007 to an individual lending model. But this individual lending model was where we had a 4 to 6 month course and a full business plan required before you could get a loan. So the idea here, the theory again, was that, look, we can take people and we can train them and we can give them a lot of the skills that hopefully we're very good at, and then by the end of that, they should be ready for a loan, which we can give to them. But again, the problem was, I think we were thinking more about our ability to serve, or sort of the theory, than how it works out in practice and what clients were actually telling us. So in reality, this meant, again, we can only take on clients once a semester, which when you think about it means we can only take on clients who are interested in starting a course at one point in any given 6-month period, which is really limiting to the number of people that you can serve. The second thing is there's pretty high dropout, because frankly, not everyone wants to sit through a 4 to 6 month class. And in classes, there's often wide variance in quality. And we lumped everyone together in the same class, regardless of whether they basically had an existing business and just needed a piece of capital equipment, or whether they had just the idea that I want to start a restaurant. And obviously those two are very different places and don't take a lot of value from the same types of learnings. And then the additional thing is there's just a huge barrier to entry, to having a really long training course, to have someone commit to that before they can get a loan. You're not going to get many loan applications like that, frankly. We then, you'll notice, a 2-year gap here. This was where we had a very heavy shift towards a training focus. So this is part of it, is that we really invested a lot into a course. We really did a lot of one-on-one consulting. That was where most of our clients were. And also in this period, there was some uncertainty around basically the lending practices in 2006 and 2007, or actually prior to 2007, had not been the best in the sense of we weren't collecting the right types of data, sort of the last presentation, and we actually didn't have great tracking on what was success, what wasn't. And even in some cases, there was uncertainty about the actual repayment rate, which we eventually locked down and have it corrected now. But the bottom line was there was concern about whether institutional memory was really in place in a way that we should be doing what we were doing. So a lot of 2008 and 2009 was putting in some of the systems that we sort of talked about in terms of institutional memory and making sure that we didn't have those sort of gaps in knowledge that we'd had previously. And that now anyone who comes back in 10 years and wants to know what happened in 2011 will be able to know that. So we switched though in 2010 to a membership model, which was basically you applied to be an LMC member and then you had access to a suite of services, either our classes, consulting, or loans. The idea was that we could serve a broader range of clients. There were sort of more entry points so that someone could come in and just do one or the other. They didn't have to take the course before getting a loan. But it ended up sort of being an inefficient use of time, is that anyone that we accepted in membership could still get consulting. And frankly, there was a lot of sort of waste there because we were consulting with people who weren't quite ready for it. And there was also the problem that we sort of had a flat fee regardless of how much we were working with someone. So $30 regardless of if we met with you once or if we met with you 10 or 20 times. And then this year we've moved to a fee-for-service model. And what you can see is, especially in the past year, we've had a huge jump in the amount of lending we're doing, and that's an intentional shift. So we actually came into this semester with a goal to give out 10 loans, and we're pretty well on our way to that. And the other thing I think about this is that we're not only giving more loans, but the quality of loans that we're giving is actually improving. Right now, with loans originated in the past 12 months, we're at 100% repayment. We had to write off a loan from earlier, 2010, part of it. But the most recent loans we've given under this most recent model are all fully repaid and actually haven't missed a payment yet. So we're pretty excited about that. And what we think fee-for-service allows us to do, so basically we have 3 distinct products. We have loans, we have consulting, and then we have a business training course, is that we have a better sense of what we're doing in each of those things. there's not this sort of vague idea that you go into consulting and everyone in consulting sort of progresses to a loan, which was a little bit of the assumption that we had. And instead we're better able to target and better able to triage in the sense that someone, there's sort of a progression from the course to maybe consulting to maybe a loan, but you don't have to do that. So the final point I'll just make briefly is sort of a more recent shift towards continuing delinking. And what we mean by that is separating our training and our lending services. So previously we had been linked in the sense that basically we assumed there was sort of one track for all clients, that sort of everyone's progressing towards a loan. That was the sort of terminology we used, that someone was in the program and we thought, within a few months they might be ready for a loan, when that's really probably the wrong way to think about it. There are people who are in consulting because we can do a really good job there helping them develop a marketing strategy or do a business plan or figure out financials or track their own business better. And then there's people who need capital expenditure, which is the problem we're solving with a loan. And those are two separate issues. So we try to separate those as much as possible. The other problem under the linked model was that the consultant is sort of viewed as a gatekeeper. So it's this person that you're working with for maybe a couple months, and then you say, I want to apply for a loan, and it looks like the person you've been working with is the one who gets to make the decision, when that was not the intention that we wanted, and that's the way it sort of ended up. And the other problem was that we didn't get a credit report until really late in the game. So we helped prepare an executive summary and historical financials and all of this stuff, but then we'd figure out that someone has a $20,000 federal credit lien, and really we're not going to be able to lend to them. And that's a huge letdown with someone you've worked with for a couple months, and then you have to tell them, sorry, we can't help you. So delinked model now means that consulting and loans are two completely separate products, so it helps relieve the tension at the consultant level. So consultant can sort of serve as an advocate, so if someone is in a consulting relationship and they decide to apply for a loan, they can give a little bit more color around the business when we're trying to review it. They can also sort of serve more as an advocate, whereas a loan officer is a distinct function and they are purely on the review side of things. And we can also, again, something we actually talked about a lot in the visit that Vanessa and Rohan had a couple of weeks ago, the site visit, is how do we get to know faster? Basically, how do we figure out if we're not going to be able to do a loan and make sure that we're not sort of leading someone on about our ability to do that if we're not going to be able to. And this is sort of part of that continuing shift towards delinking, which is our own sort of preliminary application form, which is modeled on some of the other ones that a lot of the other groups here already have themselves. So that's sort of Elmseed's a couple bits, one on sort of institutional memory and how we manage challenges and turnover, and then a second on sort of our evolving model. Happy to answer questions, but probably should do that at the end, or should we do that now?
Yeah, why don't we do a couple other sessions quickly so we can have
Definitely, yeah.
more time for